Hey everyone, and welcome to No More, a podcast that envisions life after trauma. My name is Mireya. I am the creator and host. This week, we are yet again joined by John Kajander in a part 2 conversation about mental health and a broken healthcare system. Last week, we talked a lot about how a broken financial system that is rooted in transactional-based care, it's a service for fee system, excluded trauma because trauma is not transactional. It's not measurable, it's intangible and invisible. And because it was an unknown, it was excluded from the conversation and ultimately stigmatized. If you haven't listened to last week's episode, I highly recommend it. Today, we are facing this mental health crisis. However, John and I talk about envisioning what that healthcare plan looks like. And that doesn't just include the technical aspects of revising and redesigning a system or talking about new hires, although we do need more doctors and nurses and people in the field of psychology. However, mental health, being able to incorporate it into the healthcare system, is also talking about the way that we understand mental health disorders and trauma. That stigma arises from an unknown. Revising any system is quite difficult, but systems are backed by our beliefs. They are actions driven out for our benefit. This means that we have to change the way that we understand mental health. People are not crazy, they're not defective, and they're not incurable. What people are going through is unfortunately hard to gauge in terms of long-term healthcare plans. John provides us with a vision for integrated team-based plans. That means bringing everybody together, including doctors, nurses, psychologists, including the patient into the conversation, including family members and community members, so that we are better able to help people get back on track and integrated back into society. For those of you who don't know, John is a life science and business consultant for healthcare with over 45 years of experience. He's also held executive positions such as the former executive vice president of the Texas Medical Center, which is the largest medical center in the world, and was the former CEO for TIR, the Texas Institute for Research and Rehabilitation. John has dedicated his life to helping people in the healthcare industry and getting the healing that they need. So I am very excited to welcome him back to have this conversation as we envision what that future looks like for a post-trauma world, for a world that is inclusive of trauma and mental health within the medical care system. For those of you tuning in on YouTube, unfortunately, we don't have video today as John very kindly joined us post-surgery on his head, but please do enjoy this photo of him from his Eric Clapton phase. Enjoy. Welcome back, John Kajander. Thank you for joining us once again as we continue the conversation and incorporating the cost and care of trauma.
Happy to be here. Always great to talk to you.
Well, taking off from our conversation last time, I wanted to take it back to the Machiavelli quote. Can you remind us of that again?
Sure. And I paraphrase the quote: nothing is more difficult to change than a system, because at most it has the lukewarm support of those who would benefit from the change, and then the undying enmity of those who benefit from the old regime.
I think when we're talking about creating a new dialogue and a new directive that concerns mental health, trauma, and mental disorders, a lot of revising systems is really about revising ideologies, because a lot of our systems are established and at most times evolve out of our social ideologies. It's why are we creating the system? How do we want it to benefit us? What is our directive and goal? I mean, as you pointed out, there are people who benefit greatly from the system and there are those who do not. This is such a epically proportioned system that it would be difficult to dismantle. So really, it's talking about revising that directive and being able to speak to the misconceptions that have been created around trauma and mental health within the medical industry and the history of healthcare.
I would say that as the system developed, it became, and we talked about this some last time, but very much transactional in nature, and which works really well for certain acute care injuries and illnesses. But when it comes to more chronic medical issues, whether it be mental behavioral health or something such as neurodegenerative diseases, ALS, MS, lupus, and those things. If it is a longer term program or illness, I think it is much more difficult to manage and optimize the care and the healing process in a manner that is congruent with how the system rewards services.
Going back to trauma not being transactional, in the first episode, it was really about how we didn't have any true information surrounding mental disorders and trauma. So we had to apply and impose those social ideologies. But now, trauma not being transactional, in my opinion, takes on a whole new meaning, and that we are devising methods such as medication. There are also certain procedures that are being performed, although less and less, where trauma is almost being transformed or trying to be transformed into something that is transactional. However, it's not a cure. It's not necessarily even a Band-Aid. And it does help a lot of patients. And that's something that we're going to get further into along in the episode. But it takes on a whole new meaning that the methods that we apply to physical ailments still aren't transferable to treatments for trauma and mental health.
I think that's a pretty good point. When I think about how the communities, and when I say communities, those who are financing healthcare, as we talked about, it's been primarily businesses that have done that, and the government with people who are over age 65, and for those people who, women who are pregnant, disabled adults, and people who are financially not able to provide for themselves through the Medicaid program. When you look at all of that and how it is developed, if they couldn't figure out how to pay it right, if they couldn't figure out, they just began to cut benefits. If we don't see somebody getting better, then we look at this and say, well, this is going to cost us X million dollars over X number of years, or how much it would be. And they're saying, well, we can't afford that in the plan, so therefore we're going to create what is possibly an arbitrary cutoff on benefits. And we did that in the 1970s and 1980s in particular, as we limited benefits for people with mental health conditions. By deinstitutionalizing people around the same time, we created a whole cohort of homeless people, people with very serious mental conditions. Really, really has been a difficult thing to figure out how to manage it. And we have not done an extraordinary job of doing so. But if you also look at other industrialized nations, if you look at others who have a public healthcare financing system, they've been struggling with it as well. And one of the things that they've done is they've enacted universal budget cuts. Only a certain amount will be funded, and anything beyond that is out there in the ether. So it's not just the United States who has struggled with this issue. It's really, it's across the spectrum, across multiple countries.
And this is something that we have continued to have a conversation about globally. As you said, this is not just in America, but it's how do we provide healthcare for our citizens across the world?
It's a great question. I thought one of the interesting things was, and I sent you a document a while back. It was about a country, I can't remember if it was Netherlands or Sweden, that are developing the first ever brain health plan for an entire country. It was really interesting how the country was realizing and stating to their citizens that brain health is essential to a community's health, productivity, and well-being. And by focusing on that as a nation, which not other people have done, not other countries have done, but to actually start doing that is, I think, a great way to start those dialogues, because once that's done and it's recognized what the issues are, we're going to begin to then start actually looking at more holistic interventions to make a difference in the lives of people who have, in addition to physical ailments or other than physical ailments, have had mental illnesses and challenges that have been, when you say that they've been stigmatized, I think that's true, partially because of fear of the unknown. We tend to stigmatize and things that we don't understand. But as we've begun to understand them, I think that we can get a handle with the right type of leadership in a nation. We can begin to address and bend a financing system towards a methodology that supports healthy, engaged community members.
I think that's a really interesting point to make in terms of we stigmatize the unknown. And if anything, it gives us a moment, an opportunity really to reflect on now recognizing that when we come up against more unknowns, we need to be able to recognize it as an opportunity to understand it rather than applying an idea or our own subjective perspective onto it. And then that way we're actually able from the get-go to really assess and understand what is the problem that we're facing so that the people who are mostly and greatly impacted by it can access the help that they need. But I do love this conversation of when we are helping people within our community who are suffering from an invisible pain, we are also helping the overall community. And I think so much of the time that is the problem when it comes to going back to, revising a system where some people benefit and some people don't. And it's the question of, well, why should I help them? And that's a much larger question that applies to a myriad of systems across the board, across the US and other countries around the world. But it really goes back to your community is impacted and benefit in totality when you start helping people who are affected by trauma. The way that I see it is we have characterized trauma. We understand, we talked a little bit about this in the previous episode. We understand people who suffer from trauma as the homeless person on the sidewalk, the addict on the bus, the alcoholic and abusive father, or the emotional and irate mother, even kids in school who feel alienated because they come across a certain way or they're depressed. And again, it's that right there is an example of that unknown. I don't know what's going on. I don't understand where this is coming from. And therefore it becomes stigmatized and it becomes characterized. So a lot of the way that we've handled care, or rather the lack of care around it, has stemmed from really our inability to understand what's going on. And so we kind of avoid it. And we even see that in the initial traumatic events as well. And I think this is a greater opportunity to say, we need a new directive. And in doing so, we need to have a realistic conversation about the reality of what trauma is and what mental health is, because nobody wants to be suffering from either.
But when you're a young boy or girl and you run across somebody with mental health issues, you're in general, a child or an adolescent are not emotionally mature enough to recognize it, empathize with it, and be helpful to people because it's a behavior that you don't understand, that doesn't make sense to you because you don't have any you don't have any background in general to recognizing why a person's doing what they're doing, how they're acting out or what's happening. It's just different. And so you tend to fear it. You tend to, when you're in a group setting, sometimes then, it's okay to make fun of it. And it takes a long time for an individual just growing up to be emotionally stable enough to be able to recognize, empathize, and help. And so there's a lot of, not only to get to that point, but that also means that you had X number of years of unlearning to do, right? Because we learn that different is wrong. Everybody wants to be doing this, and then it takes a long time to get there. So that's why, is this something that starts with better conditioning training at the young end, or is this something that I think we need to start at the top? I actually think that we as a nation have to sit down and begin to understand this.
We talked a little bit about this last time, where there is a schism between people who have experienced trauma and people who haven't. And it really is about integrating people together into one community, because we are one community. And to add on to that, in terms of experiencing traumatic events in childhood, whether it is the environment that you're in or it's a more directly impacted event or events, as a child, because you don't understand, you also begin to normalize these problems and you don't recognize them as problems. They become integrated into your everyday. So it also takes time to understand that what's happening around you, or to reflect back when you're at a more emotionally mature stage, or have the opportunity to be separate from that environment, to be able to reflect back and recognize, oh, this is wrong. And that is where trauma is really in a way, in quotes, contagious. It does affect everybody around you. It's not solely the person who's the victim of it, but it's also how they are projecting their pain outwardly, and that affects their families, as you said, their children, their communities, their place of work, friends.
It's a great point. It's also why the healing process, if that's what we want to call it, is far more than just linking somebody with a mental health professional. It's far more. It's really, how do you talk to your community members, to your friends, to your cohorts, and how does it integrate, or does it integrate with your physical health and well-being? Is the best way to address this through more of a healthcare team, a clinician, a clinical team that includes you, includes your family, includes the people you are closest to, and is the best way to optimize health for that individual, for those communities, by working on that together. I think there's a great model. I don't know if Dr. Ivanhoe talked about this during your program, is when it comes to neurological rehabilitation, it's not just the physical medicine rehabilitation doctor who provides the care. They actually lead a team that includes neuropsychology, includes nurses, includes physical therapy, occupational therapy, family members, and they all develop a plan to help that individual. With Dr. Ivanhoe's case, it'd be, somebody with a brain injury, to help them develop a plan going forward. And it's much broader than just that piece. It's much broader. And I think as we look how to move forward dealing and helping individuals with trauma, with mental health challenges, it is a more comprehensive approach that will be the most effective.
I love this idea of a team coming together to craft a plan, because when you are traumatized, essentially there is a part of you that's cut off, because in order to cope, I know with PTSD, symptoms are, nightmares, flashbacks, dissociation. Dissociation is a really core component of a lot of mental disorders and trauma itself. In order to reintegrate yourself back into society, you need to reassociate. Part of planning is taking people from this traumatic space and helping them little by little take those steps out. But then also, as we're talking about addressing life after trauma in this podcast, it's how do we get people back to their lives? Because that's the key component of all of this. We need to start building plans for people to step back into reality, into living their lives, because at times it can be overwhelming, and the healing process many times can take quite a long time. I mean, this is something that I've seen with people and was even brought to my attention. The healing process can be a bit of a familiar space at one point. The sense of healing, it becomes a fixation or an obsession, and people feel very comfortable there. So having a support system around you to say, hey, here are manageable steps for you to re-enter, it creates a space of calm and almost gives people guardrails stepping back in after experiencing something that disrupts their reality.
I think that's a great point. It takes a lot of work, and it is, it's not something that, okay, it took you a long time, but it's 18 days later, I'm okay now. Thanks for your help, everybody. It doesn't, it comes back, it loops back, it manifests itself in little different ways. It sounds cliche, but it's a journey.
It really is. It's a conversation I have with my own mom. For me, it's been 9 years since I really started doing the work, particularly. I always tell her, I'm like, this is something that's invisible, intangible, and immeasurable. There's always going to be little things. That's not to say that things are always going to be there, but even, 20 years out of healing and recovery, there's going to be some small trigger, in having something to hold on to and being able to access a form of treatment. It's like having a safety net. It's a grounding feeling. And it's knowing that you still have the opportunity to receive the help, even when you have what you think is a little bit of a setback.
Right. Again, it's one of the big differences between mental health disorders, trauma, and physical and acute care. When you have some injury or illness, you're not necessarily worried about, I'm going to break my arm again if this happens. It's not like that. When you have a chronic illness, stress sets off some neuromuscular episode, or, just over the years, it drags on. When you have something just like my father-in-law has with anemia, he knows that he's going to cycle down in terms of his blood, and he'll need a transfusion eventually. When it happens, he'll be up again up until the point it heads down. And so he knows he has to manage his life as he goes forward over the long term for a very chronic illness. And that is a different thing than saying, oh, I just lost my gallbladder and, I have to heal. It's just entirely different.
Well, I think that those ailments are more encapsulated. You have a more definitive understanding, whereas mental disorders, you don't. When it comes to creating a new directive around mental health, as we're highlighting the importance of recognizing trauma and the long-term care that's necessary for it, it does beg the question of how are we expanding our understanding of our directive of the healthcare system?
The fundamental is what needs to change in our current healthcare system in order to more fully support those with trauma and mental health issues is really the fundamental question. To start with, I think we need to integrate our mental health professionals within the primary care setting. I think that, and there's been various efforts to try to do that. A lot of times they end up being just cohabitation, meaning that you have a physician's office and a psychiatrist or psychologist or clinician subleases some office space, and they end up running virtually their own separate practices, and they don't necessarily bring it together. But I think that they need to be literally on a team, and the team needs to huddle about every patient every day, and they need to develop a plan that integrates mental health, behavioral health care, primary care, because it could be things that considering diet, could be things considering physical location, physical therapy in order to overachieve, be able to break through certain limitations they may have physically. But there needs to be an ongoing care team. And that team needs to be, reimbursed for the plan, not necessarily for how many things you chart or, how many things you cut. If you do 5 fingers, you get 5 times the pay. And I'm being a little flippant there. But in other words, they should be paid based on the plan they develop, the way they sell it, and the way they manage and monitor and get the patients and their family and community to buy in and to comply with the care plan that is developed.
You're creating a cost-effective and concise plan where you're buying almost essentially packages because it is a long-term health plan, but you're buying these packages. There are no hidden costs, no hidden fees. This team is coming together to talk specifics about what steps this patient can take. So it would change the dialogue and the planning necessary for a patient.
Yeah, it would change by being able to get those services engaged in a manner, I think, that is more integrated and is more focused. Obviously the plan's you're never gonna hit all 82 boxes to check. Things are gonna happen, and it's gonna move left or it's gonna move right, and you have to adopt and change. You have to actively manage the process. But you do have a roadmap. You have a plan. And by the way, not only is the plan good for the clinicians, for the providers who are doing those things, because they know what they've got to do. They know what resources they have to spend. They know what skills they need on their care team. But it gives the sense of the individual who is having those mental health issues, hey, I've got a plan and I've got somebody who's helping me. And they're not alone. And they aren't obsessing over, oh my God, what's going to happen when this happens to me again. They now say, okay, if this happens, here's what I'm going to do. And here's who's going to respond. Here's how I'm going to be able to help myself, whether it be leader of my community of faith, whether it be my family or my siblings, or whether it's my significant other, or, whether it's a member of the psychiatric team that they're working with, whether it's a counselor, whether it's an agency of the law enforcement, of the law, who knows that there are certain individuals that have mental and behavioral health challenges. They know if they get a call on that person, they know they're coming in. They'll come in with a counselor or healthcare professional as opposed to coming in with their guns drawn. That's the type of integrative approach that would make a huge difference, I think, in our community.
It would also offer a couple of things. It would It would give people the sense of stability in terms of they could plan for the long-term cost because they would actually be able to gauge and to calculate it over time. It also grants them,
To some degree, yes.
it grants them the security that they're seeking. And as you said, if things fall through, they have a team, which is the other component of healing through trauma. It's having, in a way, validation, because when trauma is an unknown, it's difficult to address by the individual. But then also that feeling of isolation or alienation from people who don't understand what you're going through, having a team saying, we support you, we're mapping out a plan, we are communicating with you, we are creating a pathway, and we're working together to get you to move forward. There is that sense of validation and safety.
And as long as the individual is willing to move forward, they've got a support team.
As you're talking about creating this integrative product and the way that we are discussing how to invite in trauma, mental disorders, creating those long-term plans, and the overall directive of healthcare, what I keep thinking of is, taking these social ideologies and taking a moment to reimagine how we want to provide healthcare to people. What you're talking about is this complete shift. And we've spoken about this before. I know you're a big fan of creating these integrative, collaborative spaces. And even when we've talked about the development of AI and people, from different medical offices running patients' information through AI, you talk specifically about, get people in a room together, get people talking, and shifting the way that people operate in order to help their patients, managing that information, managing the long-term care. It requires more of an investment from doctors. Reimagining the way that we operate within a healthcare system also allows us to reimagine the way that we show up for the people around us, for our citizens, for patients, for a healthier nation. It's not, here's an individual, they're coming in and they have different services, and a multitude of services could be tacked on, or you could accidentally be out of network, or the doctor could be, or whatnot. You're reimagining the relationship between healthcare, doctors, and the teams with their patient.
Right. And the key there is with the patient, not for the patient, but with the patient. The patient herself or himself are part of that team and part of the conversation on a regular basis when they're developing a plan. It's not something that is done arbitrarily to a patient. It is something that is constructed with the patient and with the patient's understanding, allowing them to fully hear and to be able to put themselves in a place where they become part of the solution. So it also, we're talking about changing the relationship in that sense from the patient just listening to what the doctor says, or the psychologist says, or the nurse practitioner says, or whomever it is, but it's actually having a dialogue with them, recognizing everybody's role and responsibility in that dialogue. And that's not easy. And by the way, there's hundreds of stumbling blocks to this type of reimagination. And it's everything from there's no reimbursement program currently that would support this. There's probably not staffing, professional training for this for the most part. And in particular, outside of urban areas, there's probably not the resources, the people resources that could effectively do this in rural areas where they have a shortage of either physicians or psychologists or nurses or neuropsychologists or counselors, or even enough people in communities of faith that could be assistance. Even if there was a change in the way we funded things, the distribution of the clinical assets will always be a limitation to providing this type of care.
Something I just want to touch on that came to mind was trauma is dissociative. It is you're disengaging from life. It is, in a way, you are fragmented. Systems that are fragmented and disorganized can't help patients who are fragmented and disorganized, but an integrative system can help patients with trauma and mental disorders reassociate and integrate as best and effectively as possible.
That's a really logical statement. I believe that to be so, but I don't have any facts to prove that is so. But I like how you're thinking about it. It makes sense to me.
I guess all of these things are logical. There are no facts, there's no history to draw on. But at the same time, as someone who has worked, especially on the economic and business side of medicine, how do you see that vision becoming a possibility?
I see it happening in small pockets. And I think what will happen is that as more and more of the successes of programs like that are seen, that they'll become models and more communities will begin to adopt them. And they will have support from those communities that have seen them effective. I've mentioned to you several times, we've talked about some of the work that we do for the underserved population in San Antonio. They've done a number of unique things, one of which they make sure that there are people who are trained in mental health to actually go out on calls or be in a call center to help police when they come across an issue where there's somebody with a mental health issue maybe escalating and they need to do an assessment. And so by doing that, the risk of the confrontation becoming deadly has reduced dramatically because they have a clinical health professional helping them either talk to the patient directly or coaching the law enforcement professional on how to de-escalate a situation. This is one example of how in small bits we begin to see some progress in kind of creating avenues to help people with mental health conditions navigate our various social structures more effectively. And that's just one example. I think another one is actually, I'll go back again to the care teams that neurological rehabilitation takes. Those are, I think, the success of those have now become the standard in the neurological rehabilitation community by having a patient care team directed by the physician, making sure that the nurses, the therapists, the neuropsychologists, the patients, the family members are all engaged in that process and that they coach them. I think that is another example of where we've seen huge benefits. And I think that more and more outside of the rehabilitation specialty, we're going to start seeing more and more of that as it's become, I think, more widely known. Those are just, I think, a couple examples. So success is going to breed success. The other thing that's going to happen is that there's going to be shortages in certain areas that are going to force some real creative thinking. If there's not enough psychologists, they're going to have to figure out how do you extend that professional expertise into a broader layer of individuals. And as some of those concepts and trainings permeate, there's going to be a greater understanding of the need for that type of care going forward. So it is actually an unintended consequence of a clinical shortage that will actually help train the next level of paraprofessionals and others down, that I think is going to create more of a culture of accepting and working towards long-term care plans.
The two things that you were speaking to, one, creating awareness throughout different organizations and institutions, for instance, the police force. And then the second being incentivizing or creating an incentive for the younger generations to study psychology or other mental health positions in school. Those two things in a way aligned in terms of the cultural shift and the dialogue that we're creating around mental health, because when we're talking about applying that awareness to institutions, it's recognizing that, one, people are not bodies moving through time and space, eating, sleeping, going to work. We're not just physical beings, but we have thoughts, feelings, emotions, experiences. And a lot of those experiences are stressful and or traumatic, or we are born with or predisposed to a genetic mental disorder. The younger generations, especially with social media, you see an enormous amount of conversation concerning mental health, self-awareness, spatial awareness,
right,
and wanting to be recognized, people wanting to be seen. So ultimately, everything you're saying aligns with people want to be seen, and we need to start implementing that into these institutions and systems to recognize and see people. It's going back to destigmatizing the person and the situation. It is recognizing and assessing what situation you are walking into. What are they going through? What are they dealing with? As you were talking about the police force, all I could think of is I have a friend who has a child who is severely autistic. And at some point, that child is going to grow up. They are nonverbal, lacking survival skills. The parents worry whether or not, if they're not around, if their grown-up child gets into a situation, how are the police going to respond? Are they going to respond with brute force? Are they going to respond with understanding? And that is also a moment of traumatic impact for that person who doesn't understand the situation. So it really is being considerate and being able to assess the situation. And in order to do that, you need to have the awareness, the understanding, and that all starts with creating the dialogue, having those conversations, making it a priority, because that's now part of the job. We recognize that we understand it. We need to now incorporate it.
That's a good point, and I think your example, I think, is an extraordinary one. We do have the ability and the technological ability to help identify individuals who need specific help and assistance. You mentioned because of where they are on the autism spectrum for the individual. There's actually a program here in Houston that was started by University of Texas and Baylor College of Medicine, Independent Living Resource Utilization, ILRU unit. And its goal is to take individuals who have a disability and to help them integrate and be as independent as possible in the community. And one of the things, for example, that they had done, they put together a registry of individuals who were mobility impaired, that in the event of a major storm event where evacuations would be necessary, or would they be at risk for flooding or other storm damage, those individuals are identified and easily identified for rescue workers, for individuals, for law enforcement, that they can then be contacted immediately to help them make sure that they are not lost when it comes to a weather or other type of emergency. That's the type of thing that with technology that we actually have abilities to do. Some of it we struggle with because of PHI, private health information, and what is private and people should have access to, what is there for the public good and individual good. And so, and that's, by the way, we could do an entire series of podcasts on that issue. But I think it'd be incredibly boring, so don't do it. But I do think that that's an example of how we could think about how to be providing care programming for individuals with trauma and mental health issues. One of the reasons I really give the city of San Antonio credit is that they, by putting together the service teams that they have, making sure that they have access to mental health professionals, I believe makes a big difference in how they're able to respond to their community's needs. Then, what are the challenges that we're talking about trying to reinvent part of a system in order to better accommodate individuals who've had trauma? And there's a great benefit to communities having a better understanding. One of the challenges is, you probably know the statistics of trauma and mental health. Do you know in the population what the estimate of people with trauma and mental health issues is in terms of the percentage of individuals?
I know that it's every 3 out of 10 based on the statistics that I've read. However, I have to question that statistic because of the history that has created the conversation that we are still currently finding ourselves in. There is an understanding that not as many individuals are coming forward.
Right.
Fear of shame and being ostracized and further alienated, which only exacerbates the issue. So I'm not sure that that's a true representation.
When I remember looking up some of those statistics, the 3 out of 10 number included individuals who were not self-identified as having mental behavioral health issues. And I may be wrong, so take that with a pound of salt. It still means that 7 out of every 10 do not have mental and behavioral health issues that have manifested themselves at this point. And it's difficult to get people who do not have a specific interaction with it on a regular basis to take the time, the attentions, and the resources to truly understand it. And that's, I think, a struggle of how to change the culture and the system. If it doesn't affect me personally, I'm not sure how much time I'll spend learning and understanding it. Not because I'm a bad person, but because everything else, I'm overflooded with everything in life, and I've got to figure out, pick and choose what I can spend time and attention with and what I can't. You've got to make a compelling reason why the 7 need to understand the 3. And I think there are all sorts of compelling reasons to it, but that's probably all the challenges you have, fractured funding, everything else. You've got to convince 7 out of 10 community members that it is really important for them to understand the other 3.
Absolutely. But I do think one of the key components of that would actually help incentivize learning and understanding trauma would be to build better relationships with the people around you who are affected by that. And
great point.
I think emphasizing friendships and relationships and your connection to people, because we live in so many ways in a very individualistic and isolated world at times, the way that we're going, I think emphasizing the ability to connect and to understand and engage with one another and creating that emotional vulnerability and being seen, I think would be a really great driving point, again, in incentivizing people to learn about trauma.
I think, first of all, we're social animals. We are. I would say it's establishing those social connections with individuals who have some connection to trauma or a mental health challenge. Doesn't necessarily have to be the person. Maybe it's a family member. Maybe it's, a community member. Those are the types of things that make, and the more you then understand that, then the more you'll understand others. If you're able to make that first leap in, as opposed to run away from it because you fear it.
One of the things that comes to mind is when you're talking about 30% of the population, which out of over 330 million people is still quite a lot of people who are suffering from mental illness and wanting to be recognized, it just highlights how important this conversation is, because the purpose of those conversations are, I want to be seen, I want you to understand me. And I think the emphasis of relationships is important because it's no longer just talking about somebody who's experiencing trauma. It's saying, what about my relationship with you? I want to be seen. I want to connect with you. I want you to understand me. And I have that with a lot of my friendships where, my friends a lot of the times don't understand the things that I've gone through or go through, but they make the effort to understand me and to value me as a person because it's a part of my experience that shapes my world and shapes the way that I interact with them and everyone else. Yeah. So I think connectivity is really the way that we can engage people back into that conversation. As we talk about shifting the dialogue in order to create a new narrative that would allow for the creation and implementation of new methodologies and treatments and creating a more integrated product to create the opportunity for trauma and mental health care. And doing so would actually allow us the opportunity to not only treat trauma itself, which, as we have talked about, is the symptom. Mental disorders are the symptom of trauma.
Right.
And we talked about this a bit in your former episode when you spoke about your experiences with San Antonio and addressing the homelessness crisis. You all found that in many cases, if not most, people were suffering from trauma, mental disorders, and were coping with alcoholism, addiction, and substance use to self-medicate.
What they found, as we talked earlier, is of those people who seeked healthcare or had healthcare services during a year that also were identified as homeless, that between 2 out of 3 or 3 out of every 4 had a mental health issue as a primary or secondary diagnosis. The other thing that we found out, though, was how medically complex so many of those patients are. And so an approach of just sobering somebody up or just getting emergency care or just was not the right way to manage their care in a manner that they wouldn't recycle constantly into the emergency room, into, urgent care systems. What they found out is they put together a program what they call PCIC. I'm trying to remember. There's like patient-centered intensive care, which was really putting together a suite of services, social services around this individual, and they would treat the physical, cognitive, emotional needs, such as the reason why this patient isn't getting treated is they don't have a ride. So they make sure that they got a ride to their doctor's appointment. But they put together all these intensive services for this person over a period of time, and they found out that it ended up, if you looked at other individuals who had the same types of diagnoses but weren't treated that way, the cost savings and the patient outcomes was so much better for these patients that had these integrated intensive services provided to them. And these are the people who were probably the sickest of the sickest and most medically complex. Is they created this intensive team around him and made a huge difference over the next year plus outcome for those patients. So it's really something that can happen. I'm seeing it happen in extreme cases where somebody had a diagnosis of homelessness, a high utilizer of healthcare services, multiple episodes in an emergency room over a period of time, multiple medical diagnoses.
Which brings us back to what you were talking about earlier in creating those integrated teams and packages so that when treating for the long term and mental health, people are actually able to gauge on both sides of that relationship between the patients and the medical teams and understanding how much is the cost in terms of the resources that we're providing? What are the resources that are needed? Because each individual is different and therefore each package is in a way unique.
Each one would be unique, and it would be a real challenge to develop. But I think there's some real traction in there somewhere. What I would love to see someday, instead of her saying or him saying, my patient did this, I want the physician to say, our patient did this as a team member. Oh, you are our patient. Did you see what our patient did? There's not a territory fight on whose patient it is. And the patient's success is our success. To me, that's how we know we've won.
It also humanizes the conversation where it creates a more compassionate approach in terms of long-term care. This is someone that you need to build a relationship with.
Right.
And therefore, it also changes. This is something that Dr. Ivanhoe and I spoke about at length, is it changes doctors' approach and relationship with patients by seeing and speaking to patients with empathy, recognizing that they are trying to get better, integrating these practices into the overall healthcare system. It gives us the opportunity to go further beyond than just treating for the symptoms of trauma and to be able to address for the actual traumatic impact and environments that are therefore created. And one of the examples that you always use with me that I've appreciated is the seatbelt example.
The seatbelt, I think was mandated in the 1960s, and what happens is that it is one of the largest public safety successes ever in our nation. We actually got Congress to pass a law. We got the automobile manufacturers to create seatbelts and to increasingly change them to make them even more effective. And as they did that, along with making the car safer in general, and then the states then also created processes around, insurance companies, and then the states about funding. They'd receive funding if, they enforced laws about safety belts, et cetera. And so you had a whole integrated effort to make sure that culturally, legally, morally, actually, seatbelts are worn by most United States citizens today. And the resultant reduction in mortality and deaths has been astounding. It's been one of the largest successes in public health and public safety ever. And it's also had unintended consequences. As I always talk about unintended consequences. A lot of these patients or these drivers their lives have been saved. Many of them have brain injuries. Many of them have other types of injuries but they were saved because of the clinical effectiveness and the safety of that. But there has been cases where there was unintended a byproduct, an unintended consequence. That is, when a car is going 70 miles an hour and all of a sudden stops, the brain inside your head continues to move forward until it hits the front of the skull, and it bruises and it expands and cells die. And so one of the greatest public health benefits, successes we've had, has also created generations of individuals with brain trauma, physical brain trauma. Now remember that unintended consequence of brain trauma, those individuals before would be dead. So they will live the rest of their lives with a brain injury that will to some extent affect them, depending on how well they recover over a period of time. But they still get to celebrate their birthdays. They still get to see their daughters get married. They still get to experience vacations or any number of things in general. They live a quality of life that is optimal, hopefully, for them, which is extraordinary, because before, all they would be is a story at Christmas. All it would be is a passing memory, a gravesite to go visit once a year.
And I think that's something that we need to focus on when it comes to, as you say, the law of unintended consequences. That will always happen.
Right.
However, the intention is to preserve that life, to keep that life going. And because of those unintended consequences, we have now created clinics that can attend to people to help them optimize their living. And it gives them the opportunity to continue going. It might not be the life they had before, but it's a life that they can continue to work towards. And I think that is the positive mentality that we need to be having when making these decisions and implementing these laws. And I'm very curious about this example in terms of applying it to trauma, because coupled with the understanding that through treatment and providing healthcare, we are actually gaining insight into the uniqueness and intricacies of multiple individuals' traumas. And we can collect a lot of information and take the opportunity to create that integrative initiative, creating preventative care for trauma, because that is the ultimate goal of this entire conversation. Yes, it's the obvious. We want to be able to provide care to people, but at the same time, it's how do we provide care to then recognize the root causes and issues. And it's an opportunity to not move away, but to expand from physical and physiological medicine and recognizing that there are different root causes. And when it comes to mental, emotional disorders, what in society is impacting people to this large of a degree that 3 out of 10 of the population is still heavily and deeply impacted? Because ultimately, we want to create a system that helps people heal from their trauma and over the generations lessens the impact and lessens the environments that are created and that perpetuate it. We want to be able to create systems where we're not only helping patients and people overcome their pain, but we are creating an integrated community effort by supporting the patient and breaking those cycles.
Right. What I think the way I would best describe it is as I'm using similar terminology in rehabilitation. Again, we may not be able to completely heal, quote unquote, an individual who's had a emotional trauma, a brain injury, a mental health issue. But what we can do as we create a path forward for them is optimize their abilities that they have within that framework. And while their quality of life may not be the same as mine or somebody else's, it will be optimized and will be high quality for them. It may be different, but it doesn't mean it's lesser. It's a different life, but it doesn't mean it's lesser. And if we take the time to understand, to create a process or processes in order to develop those plans and paths, we can optimize the quality of life for those individuals going forward as we would for any what would normally be considered a healthy person. As a community at large C, that there are just so many positive things that are happening that we don't hear about, but what we recognize when we see it.
Well, I thank you again for joining us on this week's episode. And I know this won't be the last. I definitely look forward to next time when you don't have an excuse to not appear on video.
Well, I could go down another line on that one, but I won't. I'll say great. And I'm sure that I'm really excited about some of the other people that you said that you're going to be speaking to in the future. I think that's pretty cool.
Well, we will see you next time. Thank you for joining us on today's episode.
Peace out.
Thanks to everyone for tuning in yet again. John is an incredible professional in the healthcare system with an absolute passion to see individuals getting the help and healing that they need. And after last week's history lesson in the broken financing of healthcare, it's quite refreshing to hear such an optimistic tone in talking about what that future really looks like for healthcare. And these are all real possibilities. We're not just talking about what could be, but it is mobilizing towards that future to be able to include people in the conversation with mental health disorders and who are facing trauma. Healthcare is here to help and heal us. And part of that healing is trauma. As we face a myriad of violences and cruelties and unfortunate episodes in our lives, we need to have a place that we can come to heal and know that if ever in the future again that anything arises or we are triggered, there is a plan set up for us. We have a safety net. Healthcare is here to catch us when we fall, but it is also here to help prevent and to provide preventative care. So I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as we had in sharing it with you all. If you have ever had an experience with mental health and healthcare where you felt frustrated or dismissed, excluded from the conversation, or even stigmatized, doubted, I would love to hear about it. This is a growing conversation, and with your voices, we can build momentum and setting the system straight and setting healthcare to provide for us and to show up for people with mental disorders and take us seriously. I've personally been there. I know what it feels like. I know how expensive it can be and how daunting it feels. Trauma takes a long time to heal. It's immeasurable, but it's important to know that we have the proper care provided to us. Because what's most important is that healthcare is here to get us back on our feet. No matter the situation, we have to be able to solve for these things. So if any part of this conversation resonated with you, or if you had thoughts that you would love to contribute to the conversation, please bring them to my awareness. I would love to hear from you. You can send me a DM or comment at nomore.podcast on Instagram and TikTok. You can also catch up on all the latest reels and follow the conversation. Listen on all major podcast platforms, including Spotify, Apple, and iHeart, and watch on YouTube. Please make sure to follow and subscribe, rate, comment. Again, I'm excited to continue this conversation with all of you because it's time to say no more. See y'all next Tuesday.